In August 1847, beneath the suffocating heat of an Alabama summer, the bodies of 6 members of the Thornhill family were discovered inside their plantation manor house in Willow Creek County. The discovery sent shockwaves through the entire region, not merely because of the brutality of the killings, but because of what investigators found written in blood across the dining room wall. 3 words that would ignite the most explosive and divisive trial in antebellum Southern history. 3 words that challenged everything the community believed about power, justice, and human dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The accused was a young enslaved woman named Delilah, 22 years old, who had served in the Thornhill household since childhood. But what seemed like an open and shut case of slave rebellion and murder would, 5 years later, be revealed as something far more complex and morally devastating. A truth so disturbing that it would force an entire community to confront the violence they had chosen to ignore, the lies they had chosen to believe, and the monster they had protected while condemning an innocent woman to living hell. The Thornhill Plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of prime cottonland along the Cypress River, its fields worked by more than 60 enslaved people who toiled from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eyes of overseers. The main house stood as a monument to wealth built on suffering, a 3-story Georgian mansion with white columns that gleamed in the southern sun, surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss that swayed like ghosts in the humid breeze. Victor Thornhill had inherited the property from his father and had expanded it into one of the most profitable operations in the county, known for producing cotton of exceptional quality that commanded premium prices at market. His reputation among fellow plantation owners was one of shrewd business acumen and firm discipline, a man who understood that prosperity required an iron hand and unwavering control. The discovery came on August 14th when Benjamin Fletcher, who owned the neighboring plantation 3 miles down the river road, arrived at Thornhill for their weekly business meeting to discuss cotton prices and shipping schedules. Fletcher had known Victor Thornhill for more than 15 years, and their friendship extended beyond mere business partnership into genuine personal regard. They met every Wednesday without fail to share bourbon and conversation, to discuss politics and agriculture, to complain about weather and market fluctuations. When Fletcher arrived that Wednesday morning and found the front door standing open despite the heat, his first thought was irritation that the household staff had been careless about letting in flies and mosquitoes. The plantation bell had not rung at its usual times that morning, and an eerie silence hung over the property that felt unnatural and wrong. No sounds came from the cotton gin house where work should have been underway. No voices carried from the slave quarters. Even the dogs that usually announce visitors with frantic barking were nowhere to be seen. Fletcher called out as he approached the open door, expecting Victor to emerge with some explanation about household chaos or some minor crisis that had disrupted the normal routine. When no response came, he stepped inside and the temperature seemed to drop despite the oppressive heat of the day. The entry hall was dark, curtains drawn against the morning sun, and a smell hung in the air that Fletcher could not immediately identify, but that made his stomach turn with instinctive revulsion. He called out again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the silent house in a way that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Still nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just suffocating silence broken only by the buzzing of flies that grew louder as he moved deeper into the house. The dining room was where Fletcher found the first body. Victor Thornhill lay face down on the Persian rug, still wearing his nightclothes, his body surrounded by a dark stain that had soaked into the expensive fabric beneath him. Multiple stab wounds covered his back, and his hands bore defensive cuts that showed he had tried desperately to protect himself from his attacker. Fletcher staggered backward, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Victor, his friend of 15 years, the man he had shared countless meals and conversations with, lay murdered in his own home. But as Fletcher's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that Victor was not alone. Cordelia Thornhill was slumped in one of the dining chairs, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, blood matting her gray hair and staining the lace collar of her sleeping gown. The table before her was set for breakfast that would never be eaten, delicate china cups still waiting to be filled with morning coffee. Fletcher's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the full horror of the scene registered. He wanted to run, to flee this nightmare house and never look back, but some combination of duty and disbelief kept him moving forward through rooms that had become a charnel house. In the parlor, he found Margaret Thornhill, the eldest daughter, who at 24 had been preparing for her wedding to a merchant son from Montgomery. She lay near the piano where she had entertained guests with her accomplished playing just weeks before, her blue dress torn and bloodied, her face frozen in an expression of terror that would haunt Fletcher's dreams for years to come. Philip Thornhill, the eldest son and heir to the plantation, was discovered in the library books, scattered around his body as if he had tried to use them as shields from the blade that had ended his life. The younger son, Nathaniel, barely 19 years old and known throughout the county for his beauty and gentle nature, was found in his bedroom on the second floor. Fletcher could barely bring himself to look at his small form lying across her bed, and he turned away quickly, tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of the massacre overwhelmed him. 6 members of the Thornhill family murdered in their own home during the night, slaughtered with a violence that spoke of tremendous hatred and fury. But it was what Fletcher saw when he returned to the dining room that would become the most discussed and controversial element of the entire case. Written on the wall in what appeared to be Victor Thornhill's own blood were 3 words, in crude letters: "No more chains." Fletcher ran from the house, his breakfast rising in his throat, and mounted his horse with shaking hands. He rode hard toward Ashford Springs, the nearest town, pushing his animal to dangerous speeds along roads still muddy from recent rains. Sheriff William Blackwood was in his office when Fletcher burst through the door, wild-eyed and incoherent, gasping out fragments about murder and blood and the entire Thornhill family dead. Blackwood, a methodical man of 45 who had served as sheriff for nearly a decade, immediately assembled a group of deputies and rode with Fletcher back to the plantation, though he privately suspected the man had suffered some kind of fever dream or mental breakdown. The Thornhills were one of the most prominent families in the county. The idea that they could all be murdered in their beds seemed impossible, absurd, the kind of thing that simply did not happen to people of their status and position. But when Blackwood and his men entered the Thornhill house and saw the carnage for themselves, all skepticism evaporated. The sheriff moved through the rooms with grim professionalism, cataloging each body, noting the wounds, searching for any clue that might identify the killer or killers. The violence was extreme, suggesting either multiple attackers or a single individual in the grip of absolute fury. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The defensive wounds on Victor's hands indicated he had fought his killer, and similar marks on Philip's arms showed he too had struggled. But the women had been killed quickly, efficiently, as if the murderer had wanted to eliminate any possibility of screams alerting others or attracting help from neighboring properties. Dr. Edmund Walsh arrived within the hour, a stern-faced physician who had practiced in Willow Creek County for 30 years and had seen his share of violence and death. But even he blanched at the scene inside the Thornhill house, and his examination of the bodies was conducted with visible distress. He estimated that the murders had occurred sometime during the early morning hours, probably between 2 and 4 o'clock when the household would have been deep in sleep. The weapon appeared to be a large kitchen knife, based on the size and shape of the wounds. Walsh noted that whoever had wielded it possessed considerable strength and determination, as several of the blows had penetrated bone and required significant force to inflict. As Blackwood's investigation continued throughout the day, a disturbing picture began to emerge.
The house had not been ransacked. Valuable silver remained in the dining room cabinets. Jewelry boxes in the bedrooms sat undisturbed. Victor's cash box in the library office still contained nearly $200 in gold and paper money. This was not robbery. This was something far more personal, driven by emotion rather than greed. The message written in blood on the dining room wall suggested a motive that sent chills through every plantation owner in the region. This looked like slave rebellion, the nightmare scenario that haunted Southern society, the specter of violent uprising that kept masters awake at night and prompted ever more brutal methods of control and intimidation. Blackwood ordered his deputies to round up every enslaved person on the Thornhill property for questioning. More than 60 terrified people were herded into the cotton gin house under armed guard while the sheriff attempted to piece together what had happened. Most were field workers who lived in the slave quarters far from the main house and had seen and heard nothing during the night. They learned of the murders only when the plantation bell failed to ring at dawn and confusion spread about whether they should begin their day's labor. But it was the house servants, those who worked directly in the mansion and had intimate knowledge of the family's routines and habits, who became the focus of intense scrutiny. Ruth, the cook, a woman of 38 who had worked in the Thornhill kitchen for 20 years, was brought before Blackwood first. She was shaking with fear, knowing that the mere accusation of involvement in such crimes would mean immediate death, regardless of guilt or innocence. Through tears and stammered words, she explained that she had slept in her cabin in the slave quarters as usual and had heard nothing unusual during the night. She had risen before dawn as she always did to begin preparing breakfast, but when she entered the kitchen that morning and found it empty of the usual morning activity, she had assumed the family was sleeping late. Ruth identified the likely murder weapon when Blackwood showed her the knife found near Victor's body. It was from the kitchen. A large blade used for butchering meat and other heavy cutting tasks. The knife had been kept in a drawer near the preparation table where any of the house servants would have had easy access to it. Moses, an elderly enslaved man of 45 who served as the head butler and had been with the Thornhill family since Victor's father had owned the plantation, provided crucial information. He had seen Delilah, one of the house servants, leaving the main house very early that morning, well before dawn, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of blood-stained cloth. Moses had thought it odd at the time, but had not questioned her, assuming she was disposing of monthly rags or perhaps cleaning cloths from some household accident. Delilah had worked in the Thornhill house since she was 8 years old, purchased by Victor's father from a slave trader passing through the region. She had grown up serving the family, learning the routines of the household, trusted with access to every room and every family member's private spaces. When Blackwood's deputies went to find Delilah, they discovered her in her small cabin in the slave quarters, sitting on her narrow bed, her hands and dress still stained with blood that she had made no attempt to wash away. She did not resist when they seized her, did not protest her innocence, did not speak at all. Her silence was interpreted as guilt, as the shocked numbness of someone who had committed an unspeakable act and now faced the inevitable consequences. The deputies dragged her from the cabin, while other enslaved people watched in horror, knowing that terrible retribution was coming not just for Delilah, but potentially for them all. Slave rebellions, even suspected ones, typically resulted in mass punishments designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population into absolute submission and obedience. Blackwood examined Delilah carefully when she was brought before him. She was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, with a slender build that seemed incompatible with the strength required to overpower and kill 6 people. But her right forearm bore a distinctive burn scar, a mark she had received as a child when she accidentally touched a hot stove in the Thornhill kitchen. That scar would become conclusive proof of her involvement in the murders, though it would also raise questions that would haunt the community for years.
Crucial identifying detail, mentioned in every account of the trial, a physical marker that made her unmistakable and prevented any claims of mistaken identity. Her dress was soaked with blood from chest to hem. At her hands bore small cuts, consistent with gripping a knife blade during violent struggle. When Blackwood asked her directly if she had killed the Thornhill family, she raised her eyes to meet his for the first time, and what he saw there made him profoundly uncomfortable. Not madness, not rage, but a kind of hollow emptiness, as if something essential had been carved out of her and left behind only a shell. She spoke one sentence in response to his question, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for everyone present to hear. They deserved worse. Then she fell silent again and would not speak another word despite hours of interrogation. Her confession, such as it was, seemed sufficient for Blackwood and for the community that gathered outside the jail demanding immediate justice. The evidence was overwhelming. She had been seen leaving the scene with bloody cloth. She had been found with blood on her hands and dress. She had access to the murder weapon and intimate knowledge of the house. She had essentially admitted her guilt with those 4 words. In the fevered atmosphere that gripped Willow Creek County in the days following the massacre, most people saw no need for a lengthy investigation or complex trial. A slave had murdered her masters. The prescribed punishment was death, swift and public, designed to remind every enslaved person in the region of the absolute consequences of rebellion. But Judge Horatio Pendleton, who would preside over the case, insisted on following proper legal procedures, despite the explosive public sentiment. Pendleton was 62 years old, a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School, and a man who prided himself on his adherence to constitutional principles, even when they proved unpopular. He had served on the bench for 23 years and had presided over countless trials involving enslaved people accused of various crimes. The law required that even slaves be given some form of trial, though these proceedings were typically perfunctory affairs, lasting no more than a few hours before predetermined guilty verdicts were handed down. Pendleton knew that this case would be different, that the prominence of the victims and the spectacular nature of the crime meant the entire nation would be watching how Alabama justice handled the situation. Northern abolitionists were already sending correspondents to cover the story, eager to use it as ammunition in their crusade against the peculiar institution that sustained Southern prosperity. The trial was scheduled to begin on September 3rd, giving Blackwood 3 weeks to complete his investigation and the court time to assemble the necessary participants. Under Alabama law, slaves were not entitled to jury trials for capital crimes. Instead, their cases were heard by a panel of justices who would determine both guilt and sentencing. Delilah was not provided with legal counsel initially, as slaves had no right to representation, but the attention focused on the case prompted several complications. Northern newspapers began publishing inflammatory accounts of the massacre, with some openly questioning whether the full story was being told. Abolitionist societies sent letters to Governor Chapman demanding that the accused be given fair treatment and proper legal defense. The pressure became intense enough that Pendleton made the unusual decision to appoint a defense attorney, partly to demonstrate that Southern justice was fair and impartial, partly to protect the legitimacy of whatever verdict would eventually be reached. The attorney assigned to defend Delilah was a young lawyer named Thomas Whitfield, nephew of Colonel Jasper Whitfield, one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. Thomas was 28 years old, fresh from his legal studies in Richmond, and this would be his first major case. He had not requested the assignment and accepted it with visible reluctance, knowing that defending a slave accused of murdering white people would make him a pariah among his social equals. But his uncle, who wielded considerable influence in county affairs, insisted that Thomas take the case as a matter of family honor and civic duty. The Whitfield name would be associated with ensuring proper procedure was followed, even if the outcome was never in doubt. Thomas visited Delilah in her cell 3 times before the trial began, attempting to extract some explanation or defense he could present on her behalf. But she refused to speak beyond those 4 words she had uttered to Blackwood. They deserved worse. The jail where Delilah was held sat behind the courthouse, a squat brick building with barred windows that had housed criminals and accused slaves for 30 years. Her cell was barely 6 feet square, containing only a wooden plank for sleeping and a bucket for waste.
She was kept in chains even inside the locked cell, her ankles shackled together and her wrists bound with iron cuffs connected by a short length of chain that prevented her from raising her hands above her waist. Guards watched her constantly, fearful that she might attempt suicide and rob the community of their public execution. She ate little of the food brought to her, barely drank the water provided, and spent most of her time sitting motionless on the wooden plank, staring at nothing with those hollow eyes that had so disturbed Blackwood during his interrogation. Word of the upcoming trial spread throughout Alabama and beyond. People traveled from neighboring counties to secure lodging in Ashford Springs for the proceedings. The small town swelled with visitors, its 2 boarding houses filled to capacity, its taverns doing unprecedented business as men gathered to discuss the case and speculate about details. Plantation owners arrived with their families, viewing the trial as both entertainment and important civic duty. They needed to see justice done, needed to witness the inevitable punishment that would remind their own enslaved workers of the consequences of resistance. Northern journalists arrived as well, instantly recognizable by their formal dress and educated speech, treated with suspicion and hostility by locals who viewed them as troublemakers intent on stirring up sectional conflict and undermining Southern institutions. The courthouse was packed on the morning of September 3rd when Judge Horatio Pendleton called the proceedings to order. Every seat was occupied, and more people stood crowded along the walls and in the doorways, craning their necks to see the accused. Delilah was led into the courtroom in chains, flanked by 2 armed deputies who gripped her arms as if expecting her to suddenly transform into something dangerous and wild. She was dressed in a simple gray shift that someone had provided, her previous blood-stained clothing having been burned as evidence of her contamination. The burn scar on her right forearm was clearly visible as she walked to the defendant's table, and people whispered and pointed, confirming among themselves that this was indeed the slave girl who had worked in the Thornhill household for years, who had been trusted with intimate access to the family, who had repaid that trust with midnight slaughter. Thomas Woodfield sat beside her at the defense table, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit, his legal papers spread before him, though he knew they would likely prove useless. Across from them, the prosecution was represented by District Attorney Marcus Brennan, a heavyset man of 50 with a reputation for aggressive courtroom tactics and an undefeated record in cases involving slave criminality. Brennan had prepared meticulously for this trial, knowing that it represented an opportunity to establish his credentials for higher office and to demonstrate his commitment to protecting white society from the ever-present threat of slave violence. He had interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined every piece of physical evidence, and constructed a narrative of the crime that would leave no room for doubt or sympathy. Judge Pendleton opened the proceedings with a lengthy statement about the importance of law and order, about the necessity of following proper procedures even in cases where guilt seemed obvious and emotions ran high. He explained that this court would hear all evidence, would allow both sides to present their arguments, and would render a verdict based on facts and testimony rather than prejudice or assumption. His words were meant to reassure Northern observers that Southern justice was fair and rational, but they rang hollow in a courtroom where the outcome had been decided before a single witness took the stand. The very architecture of the proceedings made clear that this was not a trial between equals, but rather a formality required before imposing predetermined punishment. Brennan began his case with a dramatic opening statement that painted Delilah as a cunning and ungrateful monster who had plotted for weeks, or perhaps months, to destroy the family that had housed, fed, and clothed her since childhood. He described the Thornhills as benevolent masters who had treated their slaves with kindness and Christian charity, who had never been known to use excessive punishment or cruelty in managing their property. Victor Thornhill had been a pillar of the community, a generous man who donated to local churches and provided employment to white workers during harvest season. Cordelia had been beloved for her charitable works, visiting sick slaves in their quarters and ensuring they received proper food and clothing. The children had been raised with proper Christian values, taught to view their slaves as childlike dependents, requiring firm guidance rather than as mere beasts of burden. Against this family, Brennan argued, Delilah had turned with inexplicable violence and ingratitude. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. She had been seen leaving the murder scene with bloody cloth. She had been found with blood covering her hands and clothing. The murder weapon had come from the kitchen, where she worked daily. She had access to every room in the house and knowledge of every family member's sleeping arrangements. Most damning of all, she had essentially confessed her guilt with those 4 words spoken to Sheriff Blackwood. They deserved worse. What more proof did anyone need? This was not a mystery requiring complex investigation or subtle reasoning. This was open rebellion, savage violence committed by a slave against her lawful masters, and the law provided clear guidance about how such crimes must be punished. Brennan called his witnesses one by one, building his case with methodical precision. Sheriff Blackwood testified about discovering Delilah with blood on her person, about her refusal to offer any explanation or defense beyond that single damning statement. Dr. Walsh described the wounds on the victims in graphic detail that had several spectators covering their mouths or looking away, emphasizing the brutality and rage evident in the attack. Moses took the stand reluctantly, his voice shaking as he recounted seeing Delilah leave the house before dawn carrying bloody cloth. Ruth testified about the kitchen knife and confirmed that Delilah would have known exactly where to find it. Benjamin Fletcher, who had discovered the bodies, described the scene in the Thornhill house, his voice breaking as he remembered his friend Victor lying dead on the dining room floor. Each witness strengthened the prosecution's case, each testimony adding another layer of damning evidence that Delilah had committed these crimes. Thomas Whitfield attempted to cross-examine the witnesses, but his questions were tentative and ineffective. What could he ask that would cast doubt on what everyone could plainly see? His client would not speak in her own defense, would not explain her actions or offer an alternative account of events. She sat silent and motionless at the defense table throughout the testimony, her expression never changing, her eyes focused on some distant point that only she could see. Her very silence became additional evidence of her guilt, interpreted as the stubborn defiance of someone who had committed unspeakable acts and felt no remorse. On the second day of trial, Brennan introduced physical evidence that he claimed would remove any lingering doubt about Delilah's guilt. He presented the blood-stained dress she had been wearing when arrested, holding it up for the court to see the extensive staining from collar to hem. He showed the knife that had been used to kill the Thornhill family, its blade still bearing traces of dry blood, despite attempts to clean it. He produced photographs that Dr. Walsh had taken of the victims, gruesome images that prompted gasps and cries of horror from the spectators. The photographs were passed among the justices who would render the verdict, each man studying them with expressions of disgust and anger. But it was Brennan's final piece of evidence that created the most dramatic moment in the trial. He called to the stand Tobias Gray, the overseer who managed the field workers on Thornhill Plantation. Gray was a hard man of 42, weathered from years of outdoor work, known throughout the county for his strict enforcement of plantation discipline. He had worked for Victor Thornhill for 8 years and claimed to know all the enslaved people under his supervision. He claimed that Delilah had always been trouble, sullen and disobedient, prone to giving improper looks, and failing to show appropriate deference to white authority. He claimed that Victor had complained to him several times about Delilah's attitude, had mentioned that she needed firmer discipline
to correct her rebellious nature. Thomas Whitfield objected to this characterization, arguing that Gray was offering opinion rather than fact, but Judge Pendleton allowed the testimony to stand. Gray continued, describing how the entire enslaved population on the plantation had grown increasingly restless in recent months, influenced by dangerous ideas spreading from northern agitators and rebellious slaves from other properties. He claimed that Delilah had been at the center of these seditious conversations, that she had been heard speaking disrespectfully about the Thornhill family when she thought no white people were listening. Gray's testimony painted a picture of premeditated rebellion rather than spontaneous violence, suggesting that the murders had been planned and calculated rather than committed in sudden passion. When Thomas Whitfield rose to present the defense case, he had almost nothing to offer. Delilah would not testify on her own behalf, and even if she had been willing, slave testimony was not admissible in court except under extremely limited circumstances. Thomas called character witnesses from among the enslaved people on the plantation, attempting to establish that Delilah had been a dutiful and hard-working servant with no history of violence or insubordination.
But their testimony was halting and fearful, these witnesses clearly terrified of saying anything that might implicate themselves or draw white anger. Ruth testified that Delilah had always been quiet and kept to herself, had performed her kitchen duties competently, had never caused trouble or complained about her treatment. Moses confirmed that Delilah had been part of the Thornhill household since childhood and had seemed to accept her position without resistance. But these weak testimonials did nothing to counter the overwhelming physical evidence of Delilah's guilt. Thomas attempted to argue that the court should consider what might have driven a young woman to such desperate violence, that perhaps there were circumstances or provocations that had not been fully explored. He suggested that a thorough investigation of Delilah's treatment within the Thornhill household might reveal mitigating factors that would at least explain, if not excuse, her actions. But Judge Pendleton cut him off sharply, reminding him that the law did not recognize provocation as a defense for slaves who murdered their masters. The legal principle was clear and absolute. Slaves who killed white people must be punished with death, regardless of circumstances, to maintain the social order upon which civilization itself depended. Thomas made one final attempt to save his client's life by arguing for mercy rather than justice. He acknowledged that Delilah was guilty of the crimes charged, but pleaded with the court to consider her youth and the possibility that she had been temporarily insane when she committed these acts. He pointed out that she had made no attempt to flee or hide her involvement, had not stolen money or valuables that would have aided escape, had simply sat in her cabin waiting to be arrested. Did this not suggest mental disturbance rather than calculated murder? Should the court not consider whether this young woman had been driven mad by circumstances beyond her control? But his arguments fell on hostile ears in a courtroom filled with people determined to see swift and terrible justice carried out. The trial concluded on September 5th, just 3 days after it had begun. Judge Pendleton and the panel of justices retired to deliberate, though everyone knew their verdict had been determined long before the first witness had been called. They returned after less than 2 hours with their decision. Delilah was guilty of murdering Victor Thornhill, Cordelia Thornhill, Margaret Thornhill, Philip Thornhill, Nathaniel Thornhill, and Abigail Thornhill. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in the public square of Ashford Springs on September 15th, 10 days hence. The execution would be public and well attended, designed to serve as a stark warning to every enslaved person in the county about the consequences of raising their hand against white authority. When the verdict was read, Delilah showed no reaction. She stood between her guards with the same hollow expression she had worn throughout the trial, as if she had already departed this world in all the ways that mattered, and was simply waiting for her body to catch up with her spirit. Thomas Whitfield slumped in his chair, exhausted and defeated, knowing he had failed to mount any meaningful defense, but also knowing that no defense could have succeeded given the nature of the crime and the inflamed state of public opinion. Brennan accepted congratulations from fellow attorneys and prominent citizens, basking in his courtroom victory and already planning how to leverage this success into a judgeship or legislative position. The crowd that had packed the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause when the verdict was announced. Justice had been served. The social order had been reaffirmed. A slave who had dared to murder white people would pay the ultimate price, and her death would remind every other slave in Alabama about their proper place and the futility of resistance. Outside the courthouse, plantation owners shook hands and clapped each other on the shoulders, relieved that the trial had concluded quickly and decisively. They would bring their enslaved workers to witness the execution, would force them to watch Delilah hang from the gallows, would use her death as an object lesson about obedience and submission. But among the northern journalists who had traveled to cover the trial, reactions were quite different. Several filed dispatches to their newspapers describing the proceedings as a mockery of justice, a predetermined outcome dressed in legal formality. They wrote about the hostile atmosphere in the courtroom, about the defendant's strange silence and hollow eyes, about the defense attorney's half-hearted efforts and the prosecution's inflammatory rhetoric. Some raised questions about why a young woman, who had apparently been a dutiful servant for years, would suddenly commit mass murder without any apparent trigger or provocation. What had really happened inside the Thornhill house that night? Had the court been so eager to affirm slave subordination that it had failed to investigate the full truth? These questions went nowhere in the immediate aftermath of the trial. Public sentiment in Alabama and throughout the South was overwhelmingly supportive of the verdict and eager for the execution to proceed. Editorial writers in Southern newspapers praised Judge Pendleton's firm handling of the case and Brennan's effective prosecution. They condemned Northern interference in Southern affairs and suggested that abolitionist agitation was responsible for creating the climate of discontent that had led to the Thornhill massacre. If slaves were allowed to hear dangerous ideas about liberty and equality, then perhaps they would act on those ideas with tragic and terrible consequences.
Freedom and equality, if they were encouraged to question their natural position in God's ordained social hierarchy, then more violence would inevitably follow. The solution was not to investigate slave grievances, but to enforce discipline more strictly and to silence the Northern troublemakers who spread seditious propaganda. Delilah was returned to her cell to await execution. The 10 days between sentencing and hanging stretched before her like a lifetime, though she seemed indifferent to their passage. She ate almost nothing, spoke to no one, and sat motionless for hours at a time. The guards assigned to watch her reported that she never slept, or at least they never saw her sleeping during their shifts. She simply sat on her wooden plank, staring at the wall, locked inside whatever private hell existed behind those empty eyes. Reverend Augustus Moore, the minister of Ashford Springs First Baptist Church, visited her cell repeatedly in those final days, attempting to extract a confession and expression of remorse that would allow her to die in a state of grace. But Delilah refused to speak to him, would not acknowledge his presence or his earnest prayers for her immortal soul. On September 14th, the day before her scheduled execution, Moore made one final attempt to reach her. He brought with him a Bible and read passages about forgiveness and redemption, about Christ's mercy toward sinners who genuinely repented their crimes. He explained that her death was inevitable and that nothing could save her earthly body, but that her soul might yet be preserved if she would only confess her sins and ask God's forgiveness. For more than an hour he preached and pleaded, his voice growing hoarse with emotion and frustration. Finally, Delilah turned her head to look at him directly for the first time. Her voice, unused for days, came out as a rough whisper that made the Reverend lean closer to hear her words. "Ask them what Victor Thornhill did to me every night for 5 years," she said. "Ask them what Philip and Nathaniel did when their father was finished. Ask them why Cordelia and Margaret watched and did nothing. Then ask your God why I should seek forgiveness for ending what should never have been allowed to begin." Then she turned back to face the wall and would not speak again, despite Moore's increasingly frantic questions. The Reverend left her cell deeply shaken, her words echoing in his mind and creating doubts he had never before entertained. But he said nothing to anyone about this conversation, convinced that Delilah was attempting to sully the Thornhill family's reputation with false accusations designed to justify her unforgivable crimes. The dead could not defend themselves against such slander, and Christian charity required that he protect their memory from the lies of their murderer. He told himself that Delilah's words were the desperate invention of someone facing death and seeking to shift blame for her own evil actions. He convinced himself that the proper course was silence, was allowing justice to proceed without complication or doubt. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and hot. the kind of suffocating Alabama heat that made every breath feel like inhaling fire. By dawn, people were already gathering in the town square where the gallows had been erected. The wooden structure stood 12 feet tall, solid oak beams joined with iron bolts, the hanging rope already in place with its 13 coils and carefully tied noose. Plantation owners arrived in wagons with groups of their enslaved workers, all forced to witness the execution as planned. They were arranged in a separate area, surrounded by armed white men to prevent any disruption or attempt at rescue, though no one seriously expected such efforts. The enslaved people stood silent and terrified, knowing they were meant to see themselves in Delilah's place, meant to absorb the lesson about what happened to those who forgot their position. White spectators filled every available space in the square, some having traveled 50 miles or more to witness this historic execution. Vendors sold food and drink, creating a carnival atmosphere that seemed grotesque given the occasion. Children played around the edges of the crowd, too young to understand the significance of what they were about to see, but caught up in the excitement of the unusual gathering. Newspaper correspondents positioned themselves for the best views, their notebooks ready to record every detail for readers across the nation. This execution would be talked about for years, would become part of Southern folklore, would be cited whenever people discussed the dangers of slave rebellion and the necessity of firm control. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Delilah was brought from the jail. She walked between Sheriff Blackwood and one of his deputies, her chains removed for this final journey. She wore the same gray shift she had worn during trial, and her bare feet left prints in the dusty street as she moved toward the gallows. The crowd parted to let her pass, some spitting in her direction, others simply staring with morbid fascination. Delilah kept her eyes downcast, her expression unchanged from the hollow emptiness she had worn since her arrest. She climbed the 13 steps to the gallows platform without assistance, her movements mechanical and remote, as if her body was simply going through motions while her mind existed somewhere far away. Judge Pendleton stood on the platform, ready to read the formal death warrant and pronounce final sentence. Reverend Moore was there as well, offering one last chance for Delilah to make peace with God before she died. The rope was placed around her neck, adjusted by the executioner who had performed this duty 3 times before for the county. A hood was prepared to cover her face, though whether this was mercy for her or for the spectators who might be disturbed by watching her final expressions was unclear. Everything was ready. The moment had come. Justice would be served in full view of hundreds of witnesses. The terrible swift sword of law would fall, and Delilah would hang until dead, her body left on display for hours afterward as final warning to all who might contemplate similar crimes. But as Judge Pendleton began to read the death warrant, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A man was pushing his way through the assembled spectators, shouting for the proceedings to stop, waving papers above his head, and demanding to be heard. The crowd turned in confusion and irritation, annoyed at this disruption of their anticipated spectacle. Sheriff Blackwood moved to intercept the intruder, but the man's voice carried across the square with desperate urgency. He was claiming new evidence, crucial information that would change everything about the case. His name was James Whitmore, and he was a traveling journalist from Virginia who had been investigating the Thornhill case for a northern abolitionist newspaper. Whitmore had arrived in Tuscaloosa only hours before, and now he was claiming to have uncovered information that would prove Delilah's innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Willow Creek County 3 weeks earlier, after the trial had concluded but before the execution could be carried out. He had spent those weeks conducting his own investigation, tracking down sources that the official inquiry had never bothered to interview, asking questions that no one in the community wanted to answer. What he had discovered was documented in the papers he now thrust toward Judge Pendleton, insisting that the court had convicted an innocent woman, or at least a woman whose guilt was far more complicated than the prosecution had presented. The crowd began shouting for Whitmore to be removed, calling him an outside agitator and northern troublemaker. Judge Pendleton raised his hand for silence, and the authority of his position was sufficient to quiet the immediate uproar. He descended from the gallows platform and took the papers from Whitmore, studying them with a frown that deepened as he read. The documents included sworn affidavits for several people, medical records from Dr. Samuel Brighton, who practiced in a neighboring county, and detailed testimonies that painted a very different picture of life inside the Thornhill household. Pendleton's face paled as he absorbed the contents, and he looked up at Delilah standing on the gallows with the rope around her neck, seeing her, perhaps for the first time, as something other than a murderess who deserved death. The execution was postponed while Pendleton reviewed the evidence more thoroughly. The crowd reacted with anger and confusion, feeling cheated of their spectacle. But Pendleton's authority was absolute in legal matters, and he ordered Delilah returned to her cell while he investigated Whitmore's claims. Over the next 3 days, Pendleton conducted a private inquiry that would eventually force him to confront truths he had spent his entire career avoiding. Whitmore had tracked down several enslaved people who had previously worked at Thornhill Plantation but had been sold to other owners in neighboring counties. These individuals, no longer under the direct control and intimidation of the Willow Creek community, had been willing to speak more freely about what they had witnessed. A woman named Sarah testified that she had worked alongside Delilah in the Thornhill house for 3 years before being sold. She described how Victor Thornhill had begun visiting Delilah's small room in the slave quarters when the girl was only 14 years old, how those visits had continued regularly for years, how everyone in the quarters knew what was happening, but was powerless to intervene. Sarah recounted nights when Delilah would return to the quarters with bruises and blood, crying silently so as not to wake others. Another former slave named Jacob provided even more disturbing testimony. He described how the abuse had escalated as Delilah grew older. Victor's sons, Philip and Nathaniel, had begun following their father's example, treating Delilah as shared property, available for their pleasure. The women of the household, Cordelia and Margaret, had witnessed these attacks and had responded not with intervention or compassion, but with anger toward Delilah herself, as if she were somehow responsible for tempting the men into sin. Dr. Samuel Brighton provided medical records that corroborated these accounts. On 3 separate occasions over the past 2 years, Delilah had been brought to his office with injuries he had documented as suspicious: broken ribs, severe bruising, lacerations that suggested violent assault rather than accidental injury. Brighton had not reported his suspicions because the victim was a slave, and the suspected perpetrators were prominent white citizens. His records also revealed something that had never been mentioned during the trial. Delilah had been pregnant at the time of the massacre, approximately 3 months along, and the pregnancy had ended violently on the night of the murders. The most damning evidence came from Victor Thornhill's personal journal. Whitmore had obtained it from Victor's brother in Mobile, and the entries confirmed every allegation of abuse. Victor had written extensively about his relationship with Delilah, describing it in terms that revealed his complete lack of recognition that his actions constituted rape. He wrote about her as if she were an object he owned and was entitled to use. He noted her pregnancies. There had been 3 previous ones that had ended through miscarriage, and speculated casually about whether to allow her to carry one to term. He described teaching his sons how to properly control their property, explicitly stating that he had initiated both Philip and Nathaniel in using Delilah as he did. The journal entries from the weeks immediately before the massacre showed Victor's growing frustration with Delilah's emotional state. She had become increasingly withdrawn and unresponsive. The final entry, written the day before the murders, noted that he was considering selling Delilah to a slave trader who specialized in difficult property. He wrote that he would discuss the matter with Cordelia over breakfast the next morning. Pendleton read through the journal with hands that trembled increasingly. This document destroyed the image of benevolent Christian mastery that had been presented at trial. It revealed years of systematic torture, rape, and dehumanization inflicted on a girl who had been powerless to resist or escape. It showed that Cordelia had known and approved of her husband's actions. It demonstrated that Margaret had witnessed the abuse and blamed the victim herself, as if she were somehow responsible for tempting the men into sin. Pendleton faced a crisis of conscience unlike any he had experienced in his long legal career. The evidence was clear. Delilah indeed killed the Thornhill family, but she had done so after years of abuse that would have broken any human being. She had acted not out of rebellious spirit or unprovoked violence, but out of desperate self-preservation against tormentors who had announced their intention to sell her away to even worse conditions. But acknowledging this truth publicly would require Pendleton to confront uncomfortable realities about the slave system he had spent his life defending. It would force the entire community to recognize that monsters could wear respectable faces and commit atrocities while being celebrated as pillars of society. For 3 days, Pendleton wrestled with his decision while the community grew increasingly unrestless about the delayed execution. Plantation owners demanded that he proceed with the hanging immediately, arguing that whatever abuse Delilah might have suffered was irrelevant to her legal guilt. Northern newspapers began publishing accounts of Whitmore's investigation, and the story exploded into national consciousness. Abolitionist societies seized on the case as an opportunity to dramatize the inhumanity of slavery and demand that Delilah be immediately released.
Perfect evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. The case became a flashpoint in the accelerating national debate over slavery. On September 18th, Judge Pendleton issued his ruling. He acknowledged that Delilah had endured years of abuse that no human being should have to suffer. He recognized that the Thornhill family had committed terrible crimes against her. He admitted that the trial had been conducted without full knowledge of relevant circumstances. But ultimately, after expressing genuine anguish about his decision, Pendleton ruled that the guilty verdict must stand and the execution must proceed. His reasoning was that the law as written provided no exception for slaves who killed their masters, regardless of provocation or abuse. To create such an exception would effectively grant slaves the right to use violence against white authority when they deemed it justified. This would destroy the foundation of slave society. Pendleton acknowledged that the law was imperfect, that it failed to protect the vulnerable and punished victims while leaving perpetrators untouched. But changing the law was the responsibility of legislatures, not judges. However, Pendleton made one modification to the sentence. Instead of a public hanging in the town square, Delilah would be executed privately within the jail yard, with only official witnesses present. She would be spared the humiliation of dying before a jeering crowd. This small mercy was all Pendleton could offer, and it cost him dearly. The community reacted with outrage, accusing Pendleton of being influenced by Northern sentiment and showing dangerous sympathy to a convicted murderer. The new execution date was set for September 22nd. Reverend Augustus Moore visited Delilah again in her cell, haunted by what she had told him before the first scheduled execution. Now, with the new evidence public knowledge, he came to offer what comfort he could. He found her sitting on her wooden plank, as always, but something in her demeanor had changed. The hollow emptiness in her eyes had been replaced by something that looked almost like peace, as if the public acknowledgement of what she had endured had lifted some burden from her soul. She spoke to Moore more freely than she had before. She explained that she had tried everything to survive. She had submitted without resistance. She had prayed constantly for intervention that never came. Nothing had worked. The massacre had not been planned. It had erupted spontaneously when Victor came to her cabin that final night and discovered she was pregnant. He had beaten her savagely, causing the miscarriage, and had told her that she would be sold within the week. Something had broken inside her during that beating. When Victor finally left her cabin and returned to the main house, she had followed him. The kitchen knife had been in her hand before she consciously decided to pick it up. She told Moore that she did not regret killing Victor, Philip, and Nathaniel, the three men who had raped her repeatedly for years. But she did regret killing Cordelia, Margaret, and young Abigail. Those deaths weighed on her conscience, and she genuinely sought forgiveness. Moore assured her that God's mercy was infinite and that genuine repentance would secure her salvation. The days leading up to the execution were marked by intense public debate that split the county along lines that had never been visible before. Some families stopped speaking to one another over disagreements about whether Delilah deserved mercy. Churches became battlegrounds where ministers preached conflicting sermons about justice, forgiveness, and the proper order of society. Women who had never before questioned their positions in the social hierarchy began whispering amongst themselves about what they would have done in Delilah's situation, though such conversations were quickly silenced when men entered the room. The enslaved community throughout Willow Creek County absorbed the revelations about Thornhill Plantation with a mixture of vindication and terror. Many had suspected or known about similar abuses on their own plantations, but had never dared speak openly about them. Now, with Delilah's story becoming public knowledge, there was brief hope that the hidden brutalities of slavery might finally be acknowledged and addressed. But that hope was quickly crushed as plantation owners responded to the controversy by implementing even stricter controls and harsher punishments, determined to prevent any notion that slaves could successfully resist their masters. The lesson they took from the case was not that abuse should be curtailed, but that it should be better hidden. Thomas Whitfield spent the final days before the execution drafting an appeal to the state governor, arguing that Delilah's sentence should be commuted to life imprisonment given the extraordinary circumstances of her case. He worked through nights, citing legal precedents and moral arguments, building the most compelling case he could manage. But his appeal was denied without comment, the governor unwilling to insert himself into such a politically explosive situation. The message was clear. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, would not be stopped regardless of what truths emerged along the way. James Whitmore received
death threats daily, delivered anonymously to his boarding house room. Notes slipped under his door warned him to leave Alabama immediately or face consequences. Men followed him openly through the streets of Ashford Springs, making no effort to hide their surveillance or their hostility. Sheriff Blackwood assigned a deputy to protect Whitmore, not out of sympathy for the journalist, but out of concern that a northern reporter being murdered in his jurisdiction would bring federal attention that the county desperately wanted to avoid. Whitmore refused to be intimidated, continuing to interview witnesses and document every detail of the case for the historical record he was determined to create. The night before the execution, a small group of abolitionists attempted to break Delilah out of jail. They had traveled from as far north as Pennsylvania, driven by moral outrage and determination to save a woman they viewed as a symbol of slavery's victims. But their plan was discovered before it could be implemented, and the conspirators were arrested and charged with conspiracy and inciting rebellion. Their trial would take place months later, adding another layer of controversy to a case that seemed to generate endless complications and moral dilemmas. The execution took place at dawn on September 22nd in the small yard behind the jail. Only official witnesses were present. Delilah walked to the gallows with steady steps, her face calm and composed. The rope was placed around her neck, and Pendleton read the death warrant in a voice tight with emotion. Moore offered final prayers, and Delilah joined him in saying the Lord's Prayer, her voice clear and steady until the trapdoor opened and her neck snapped instantly. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the jail yard, denied even the dignity of a named marker. But her story did not die with her. James Whitmore published extensive accounts of the case in northern newspapers, including excerpts from Victor Thornhill's journal. The Delilah case became one of the most frequently cited examples in abolitionist literature, used to demonstrate slavery's inherent cruelty and the way the law protected perpetrators while punishing victims. In Willow Creek County, reactions were complex and divided. Judge Pendleton resigned from the bench within a year, unable to continue enforcing laws he had come to see as fundamentally unjust. Sheriff Blackwood declined to run for re-election, haunted by his failure to investigate more thoroughly. Thomas Whitfield abandoned his legal practice and moved north, joining the abolitionist movement. The Thornhill Plantation was eventually sold, but never recovered its former prosperity. Within a decade, the property had been abandoned and the buildings collapsed into ruins, gradually reclaimed by the Alabama wilderness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.